Paul's defence before the rulers. He is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings. Readings, Acts 24, 25 and 26. Objective: to show how Paul used every circumstance to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. Background: Paul had been saved from the Jews and sent to Caesarea by night. Like Jesus, Paul found himself a pawn in the game of politics the Jews played with Rome. He was passed to Felix, to Festus, and then to Agrippa, and finally his appeal to Caesar took him to Rome. Before Felix, Acts 24 verses 1 to 9. Paul waited for 5 days under guard in Herod's palace where the governors lived. At that time Ananias the high priest and the elders representing the Sanhedrin came down from Jerusalem to press their charge against Paul. They wanted to be sure that he was condemned this time. They brought with them a hired orator named Tertullus to present their case. He started by flattering Felix in a most insincere way. Most noble Felix, he called him. But the opposite was the case. Felix was an immoral man, described by Roman historians as a monster of lust and cruelty. He was a very different man to the humble Paul, who was in the true sense a noble man. Tertullus had nothing but hatred and abuse for the man in bonds. Directing his attack to side with the Romans of opposition to political or religious agitators, he accused Paul of 1. Agitating Jews throughout the world to rise against the Romans. 2. Being a ringleader of the hated sect of the Nazarenes. 3. Attempting to profane or treat with contempt the temple in Jerusalem. Jews wholeheartedly agreed that these charges were correct. Paul was then invited to give his defence. Paul's defence before Felix. Acts 24 verses 10 to 23. Paul began by mentioning that Felix had been a governor among the Jews for many years and would therefore be in a better position to understand Paul's defence. Paul had only been in Jerusalem for 12 days. He had gone there after many years to worship. The Jews had not found him arguing in the temple nor causing the people to riot, neither in the synagogues or in the city. The charges against him could not be proved. However, Paul confessed that he did worship in the way which they called heresy. But it was not heresy, for he believed all the things written in the law and the prophets, including the resurrection of the dead. In fact, he said, because of the hope of the resurrection, I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward God and toward men. In chapter 24, verse 16, in the Revised Standard Version, the Jews from Asia who had found him in the temple after completing his purification ceremony should have come to Felix if they had any charges against Paul. The Sanhedrin themselves had found no wrong in Paul except for the remark on the resurrection which divided them. Touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day, said Paul. That fundamental belief was no crime at all. Felix knew something of Judaism through his Jewish wife Drusilla and something of the new Christian sect. It must have been obvious that Paul was innocent, but Felix did not want to offend the Jews. They were capable of having Rome remove him from his position. He adjourned the case until the chief captain Lysias should come. Meanwhile, Paul was kept by a centurion and allowed to see his friends. Again, the truth triumphed over its evil opponents. We can imagine the frustrated Jews going home, full of hatred and bitterness for the man who once again had escaped their hands. Felix and Drusilla hear Paul again. Acts 24 verses 24 to 27. Paul's words had interested Felix and Drusilla, and they sent for him privately several times to hear more about the faith in Christ. But Paul's words about righteousness, the need for temperance or self-control, and the coming judgment made the evil Felix tremble, and he sent Paul away. However, he often called him back, not to learn more of the faith, but in a vain hope that either Paul or his friends might pay money for his release. Felix leaves Paul bound. Chapter 24, verse 27. 2 years later, Felix was recalled to Rome, apparently to answer charges of injustice and cruelty against the Jews in Caesarea. He still did what he could to please the Jews and left Paul in prison. How typical of human nature. He forgot how Paul had impressed him. Imagine what those 2 long years in chains must have been like for Paul. He had been an active man, visiting ecclesias in many places, and now he was tied to one place. However, he would have used that time profitably. He would have helped the ecclesia in Caesarea by his presence, written many letters, and prepared himself for the new work to come. In all his trials he saw the guiding hand of God and patiently waited the time when he must go to Rome. Porcius Festus. Acts chapter 25, verses 1 to 12. Festus became the new governor in Cilicia. Immediately he went down to Jerusalem to meet the elders of the people he was to govern. Even after 2 years, the Jews had not forgotten Paul. The passing of time had not reduced their intense hatred for Paul or the faith which he championed. They asked Festus to bring him down to Jerusalem, intending to kill him on the way. But Festus must have seen through their cunning. 8 to 10 days later, verse 6, Festus went back to Caesarea, and the next day sat in the judgment seat to reopen the case against Paul. The Jews had many and grievous complaints about Paul which they could not prove. This contrasted with Paul's simple and direct denial of their charges. Chapter 25, verse 8. Festus realized that Paul was innocent, but like Felix before him, he wanted to please the Jews. He asked Paul if he wanted to go down to be tried at Jerusalem. Paul knew what he could expect from the hands of the Jews. Asserting his innocence and making use of his Roman citizenship, he appealed to Caesar for the right to be heard by Roman Supreme Tribunal. This was now the means by which he could go to Rome, rather than being penned up at Caesarea or Jerusalem for years. Again, divine providence rules. King Agrippa and Bernice visit Festus. Acts chapter 25, verses 13 to 22. A few days later, King Agrippa II and his sister Bernice came down to visit the new governor. The king not only ruled a small part of northern Palestine, but he was also an important figure, having connections with some of the temple officers. His father, Herod Agrippa I, was the first who had killed James. See in Acts 12. His grandfather had killed all baby boys at the birth of Jesus. His uncle was involved with the death of Christ. What a terrible family history. Nevertheless, he was interested to hear this Jewish controversy with Paul. It pleased Festus, who had nothing definite to write of Paul to the Caesar. He quickly realized that Agrippa, with his greater knowledge of Jewish law, might be able to formulate a charge and so rid him of this knotty problem. Before the king. Acts 25, verse 23 to Acts 26 verse 29. Agrippa and Bernice came to hear Paul with Festus, as well as all the chief men of the city. They came with great pomp, no doubt with many royal and beautiful robes, parading themselves, puffed up with fleshly importance. There was an enormous contrast with the prisoner in chains, who had suffered great humiliation and hardship to take the gospel to all nations. Paul was an ambassador in bonds for Christ the true King. He has set us an example not to worry about the great men of this life or their vain opinions, for they are worthless in God's eyes. Christ told Ananias that Paul was a chosen vessel to bear his name before kings, in chapter 9, verse 15. Here was such an opportunity. On permission from Agrippa, Paul began to fearlessly proclaim the faith he had accepted. Stretching out a hand from which his chain clung, he appealed to Agrippa to listen patiently, realizing that the king was conversant with all the Jewish customs and problems. Paul outlined his early life. He had lived a very strict Pharisee, but now, he said, I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers. Verse 6. For this reason he was accused. His hope was based on the resurrection of the dead, because God had made the promise to the fathers of Israel. And as he is the God of the living, the fathers and the faithful must rise. Luke 20, verse 28 to 38. Why should the Jews dispute the evidence of their scriptures? Paul went on to show the reason for his conversion to Christ. He told of his violent opposition to the followers of Jesus and how he had set about to exterminate the Christians. The event that changed the whole course of his life was the blinding revelation of the risen Christ shown to him on the road to Damascus. Jesus was indeed the Messiah of Israel. Paul became a willing servant to the call of the risen Christ, that he bring the Gentiles to share in the forgiveness of sins and inheritance promised in the hope of Israel. It was for this reason that the Jews wanted to kill him. But, Paul explained, his preaching only followed Moses and the prophets, who of course had foretold Christ's death and resurrection. At this point, Festus, amazed that an intelligent man should talk of such unusual things, could not help saying, Paul, thou art beside thyself. Much learning doth make thee mad. Paul appealed to the king. King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest. Agrippa was not prepared to commit himself to the responsibility that would come with the admission that Jesus Christ fulfilled the Old Testament prophets. Paul wished that everyone gathered here was the same as himself, but without his chains. We can imagine the scornful looks of some of the important men. Why should they want to be like this despised prisoner who was full of zeal for such an unusual cause? Little did they realize that Paul, only of them all, will be saved on the day of judgment. What then of the ambition and pride of men? To Rome. Acts 26, verses 30 to 32. The meeting was over. The king and governor discussed Paul's position and agreed that he could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. But once freed, the Jews would not have spared him. Paul knew this, and also he must go to Rome to further the work of the gospel, as Christ had told him. In chapter 19, verse 21. Summary and lessons for us. 1. Paul witnessed for the truth fearlessly before great men, governors and kings, Jew and Gentile. He was not even afraid to show them their responsibility to God. 2. The apostle had such a love for his Father and confidence in him that he was able to look beyond the sufferings of the present, the chains, the cold dark prison, the ridicule of men, to the day of glory. We will probably never have to suffer like Paul did, but we have his example to put into practice in our lives, in all the circumstances which come upon us. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 16 to 18. These lessons are the words taken from the Christadelphian Sunday School Association notes, www.cssa.asn.au, used with permission. Please email the address on the screen if you would like a copy of their books. Email your questions to readthebible@gmail.com. And we look forward to you listening to the next lesson, which will be called Shipwreck.